Hey, and welcome to Finlos Lives. Thank you so much for joining me today. A couple of things that I wanted to talk about. Well, really one big topic that I want to dig into, and I'm going to approach it from a couple of different angles, but the main one is going to be dealing with podcasts and podcasting in general, and more specifically, podcasting as it relates to the podcast bro phenomenon, toxic masculinity, these types of things. But more generally, this is really I'm trying to get at, or I'm trying to examine something that has been permeating the zeitgeist recently, especially with the recent re-election of Donald Trump and lots of other things that are going on in the world. But this is I'm really trying to get into ways in which people who are assigned male at birth, people who are socialized as male, really struggle with open communication, with transparency and honesty, and with healthy attachments, and finding ways to connect with people within their family, with people in their community, with friends, and having lasting, meaningful relationships. And like I said, so I'm going to come at this from a couple of different ways over a series of podcast episodes, but specifically today, I'm actually looking at the phenomenon of podcasting and what role that might play in reinforcing the negative aspects of male antisocial behavior. And this is of particular interest to me, obviously, because one, I'm somebody who identifies as male. I create a podcast and run a podcast show. So this is it sort of has an ironic lens for me, because I'm very much doing this as a reflection of myself and an analysis of myself, and looking at how I approach my own behaviors in this realm. But it really does come down to trying to get at what are the barriers that we as men put in the way of having meaningful connections with other men, with people in general. And to that end, just a little bit of background, I actually have been experiencing, I'm trying not to be melodramatic about it, but, loneliness, lack of connection. I professionally am an educator, and for a long time, my social network was directly related to my professional network. My coworkers in the classroom were my teacher coworkers. And over time, people left, people moved, I left the classroom, and so a lot of those connections faded. And without the shared social and professional link of education, it is hard to build connections. I think that we all are pressured, maybe is the right word, to look to our professions, our professional networks, to fill in the gaps that we feel in our personal relationships, whether that be romantic, whether that be platonic, whether that be friendships, whether that be any sort of relationship. I think we are pushed towards productivity so much that we look to our work friendships and our work families to be replacements for actual family and friendships. Not that those things can't overlap, but I think there's an over-reliance on that sort of professional dynamic to become our all end all be all in terms of relationships. The other aspect of that, of course, is that education, and again, I'm speaking to myself personally, but I think that this is true for a lot of men. But speaking to myself, or about myself, education obviously is still a profession that is, at least as far as classroom educators, leadership roles are dominated by men, but classroom educators, which is what I consider myself to be very strictly focused on, and my passion as an educator is the classroom, but that is still a profession that is dominated by women. And so I found or when I look back at those relationships, they are largely connections with and forged by and maintained in connection with women and with people who identify as female. Not to say that there aren't other men in those networks as well. Some of my closest, dearest friends still are male people that I met in professional situations as fellow classroom teachers. But the bonds were largely maintained by our women counterparts. And I think that is something that is true in a lot of different ways. I think that in traditional cisgender heteronormative relationships, it often falls on women and females to maintain the social networks and the social dynamics, and men tend to reap the benefit of that. They tend to gain access to the women's social connections. And so these are all things that are kind of swirling around as context for this conversation. And I do hope that you hear it as that. This is a conversation. I'm never intending for this to be sort of a lecture or a one-sided dynamic. Although I am the only person speaking in this episode, I do hope to have guests come in to talk about this. But for right now, it is just me. But I am hoping that you're hearing this as a conversation that I'm challenging you, that I'm asking you to engage with what your own experiences are in relation to these topics. But as it relates to my own experience with loss of connections, with an understanding of the unhealthy dynamics within my own family, so losing some family connections and really falling back to relying on my own, nesting partner as my primary social, emotional support, I came to understand that that's unhealthy and it's untenable, and it's unfair, really, to expect that this one person who, for the bulk of our relationship, really was my gateway to social interaction outside of my work. It's not fair. So through conversations with Eva, my partner, I began to understand that there's work that I needed to do as far as understanding why it is so hard for me to make lasting, meaningful connections with people. What are the challenges that get in the way of not just meeting people, but that I set up for myself to remain isolated? Because there are messages that have become lodged in my own view of myself as to why it is hard to make connections. And oftentimes I put the blame on myself, because not that it isn't my fault, but that there are somehow inherent issues with me that other people see that get in the way, when those are largely self-imposed barriers, the negative self-talk, things like that I put up my own barriers to get in the way of establishing and building relationships. And so, for example, I have a self-perception that I am difficult to connect with. And that comes from hearing people tell me in feedback that sometimes I can be a challenging person to talk to because I don't make it easy. But the problem is not that it's because people aren't trying. It's because I often am putting up barriers to those connections because I think that I am a difficult person to talk to, and becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Apologies for that little diatribe there, that little side note. But this led me to about 6 months ago, October of 2024, after about a year of actually thinking about doing this and engaging in long conversations with my partner. I actually started a support group, which was intended to be open to other men and in a gender expansive way to build connections, to practice making connection, but face-to-face, or at least as much as possible face-to-face in real life, and sharing the difficulties that we all face in our lives, and talking about the issues that we encounter as we navigate friendships and relationships, and trying to examine our own behavioral patterns, which can become problematic, can become challenges, can become barriers to engaging in meaningful, long-lasting relationships with people of any gender. Because again, it's not fair to assume that our female counterparts or our female identifying counterparts or our people socialized as female are going to continue to do that labor for us, to open the doors for us, to make the connections for us, and for us to reap the benefits of those relationships. All that as backdrop, all that as background. I am curious to how the ecosystem of podcasting, because there are so many memes and stereotypes that go along with the typical male podcaster and the podcasts that men in general consume. And I was really curious what role that plays or has continued to play in terms of maintaining, reinforcing, or just helping to maintain that dynamic of isolation. And I don't know how else to describe it other than to say like a way of perpetuating and I hesitate to use the word toxic because it has so many different connotations depending on where you are in terms of your politics, where you are in terms of your gender identity, but it can become a toxic ecosystem of creating echo chambers of really harmful at worst, and definitely not helpful ideas. And so that's where I'm going to go. And just for some data to sort of get us started here, according to Edison Research's The Podcast Consumer 2023 report, men aged 25 to 44 consume podcasts at a rate 20% higher than women in the same age bracket. And to juxtapose that with a summary of a 2021 report from the Survey Center on American Life, which highlighted a significant increase in male loneliness, particularly among younger men, and they correlated this with declining rates of marriage and close friendships. The report indicated a stark rise in men reporting having no close friends at all, and a general trend of men having less close friends than women. The report also discussed the rising rate of relationship breakdowns, citing a correlation between lack of male emotional vulnerability and relationship failures. And that all sounds pretty reasonable, right? We have heard conversations in the news, again, especially as it relates to recent elections, just because those are the flashpoint in conversation. It's just easy to point there and say, look, these are the consequences. We have people who are experiencing loneliness, people who are having difficulty establishing and maintaining close relationships, and so they tend to turn to the easiest access point. And all throughout this conversation, again, as we're talking about podcasts specifically in this conversation, but in general, as I sort of explore the difficulties that I suspect that other men have in establishing and maintaining these close relationships, is with this word that I'm going to use a lot, which is vulnerability. It's a word that we hear a lot, and it's not just the ability to express one's feelings like that. That's sort of the lowest hanging fruit when we talk about vulnerability, but it's really the ability to be transparent. It is a willingness to share not just feelings, but experiences, and a degree of honesty that I think most men and a lot of people in general are simply not comfortable with because of whatever reason you want to throw at the wall, cultural expectations, the way that we have been, trained, the role models that we look to, the stereotypical stoic man. All of those things sort of get in the way of this need really for true and honest vulnerability and connection. And so just to kind of look at where I'm going, I'm really going to look at the emergence of, and again, I'm using this language because a lot of the research has sort of centered on this term of the podcast bro. I think that's a little bit of a reduction, a reductivist way to categorize people, but it is something that we can use as a shorthand. But the podcast bro phenomenon, I'm going to explore communication breakdowns, and I'm going to also talk about how communication breakdowns impact relationships. And finally, maybe most importantly, finding pathways back to genuine conversation. The premise here is that in lieu of genuine face-to-face, or even if not face-to-face, genuine human relationships and conversations, men are turning to podcasts. They are turning to these sort of easily consumable, well, I guess we should call it a conversation. I'm calling this a conversation, but it's easy to access. It's easy to find voices and stories and narratives and perspectives that are generally in line to our own, that then make us feel as if we are amongst friends, as if we are listening to people who are compatriots, people who think the way that we do and feel similar to that we do, without the work of actually building a relationship. And it seems to be easier. And to be clear, I'm not demonizing, obviously, again, as a creator, podcasts. I'm not demonizing men who listen to podcasts. What I am really trying to do is examine the relationship that people in general and men specifically have with the content that we consume as in lieu of actual human connection, as a means of feeling as if we are part of a community, as opposed to actually being part of a community. And I think that that's really the heart of this, is that when something is difficult, something is hard to do, it is an unfortunate consequence that rather than doing the work of figuring it out, we might instead turn to something that is easier to access. So again, to turn back to some data, according to Edison Research's The Podcast Consumer 2023 report, 54% of monthly podcast listeners are male. And of those listeners, the most popular genres are comedy, news, sports, and self-improvement. And men aged 25 to 44 listen to podcasts an average of 8 hours a week. And so the term podcast bro, as defined by cultural commentators like Dr. Jennifer Griegel, a social media expert at Syracuse University, describes a demographic of men who often use podcast consumption as a form of intellectual posturing, frequently citing expert opinions without critical engagement and using podcast knowledge as a superficial social currency. And there's a lot to that, but I think the way that I'm hearing it is that the first thing that really stands out is that word posturing. A word that I often use in conversation is peacocking. It's a way of collecting information as a way of establishing cred, right? The language that was just used in the definition was intellectual posturing, superficial social currency. That idea of currency, that the information and the knowledge that I gain is a currency that I can exchange with other people. I can demonstrate my credibility by knowing the same things that you know, or knowing more than you know on this very particular topic. The problem with it is that it does not because it is a one directional sort of means of consuming information. There isn't a real exchange of information between the podcast voice and the audience in that moment. There is no way to challenge or to question what is being said. And so instead, it is very easy just to hear it as the truth, as what is real. And therefore, the more we listen to that specific viewpoint or that specific perspective without challenge, without conversation, without dialogue, without questions, the more likely it is that we are to embed it as a truth in our psychological schemas. So there is this toxic tendency of the appeal of, and I'm using air quotes here, expert voices that can create a false sense of authority or knowledge, leading to intellectual arrogance and a dismissal of alternative perspectives. And it can also cause the listener to stop doing their own research and to only rely on the opinions of the podcasters that they listen to. And I am somebody who I consume a lot of news, but I always do my best to do my due diligence on understanding who the writers are, who the perspectives are, and that I'm getting multiple perspectives to have an understanding that there are different lenses by which we can look at the same ideas or the same topics or the same even like factual events. That is something that I think we often forget is the subjectivity of the language that we use. We can each look at an event, but depending on the source from which we're getting our reporting, the language that is used to describe the event might completely shift how we internalize the event that actually took place. So it is essential to be mindful and to be conscious consumers of information. And to do that, it really requires a lot of work. If we're going to call ourselves thoughtful and cognizant of the world around us, we can't just take for granted that what we're being told is, again, air quote, true. We have to be questioning and we have to be considerate of the voices that we're hearing, of the reputations of those that are relaying the information, of the sources that we turn to, but then also of the conversations that we then engage with those around us to say, hey, this is what I heard. What did you hear? How do these things align and how do they match up? And why are they different? And what does that mean about the sources that we're getting? Because reality and truth is something that is constructed as a communal effort. And that sounds so against the definition that we normally hear of as what is true, as what is factual. But these things are collectively driven, which is why how we view history and how we view events as they occur can shift over time, depending on who is telling the stories. Another consequence of really leaning on these so-called expert voices for doing the thinking for us is another term that has been developed, which is performative listening. Like people quoting things that they hear in their podcasts or in their information without necessarily understanding the context or really applying the ideas to themselves as a means of being conversation starters, as a way of gaining access to conversations, but without necessarily doing the work of engaging with genuine follow-up. So in that way, this content becomes a social tool rather than a learning tool, which I think is an important distinction because a lot of this, remember, is instigated by a sense of isolation. So having certain phrases and ideas that we espouse as being truthful can then function as keys to gain access to certain social groups. And what that leads to is a feeling of community, a feeling of being part of something that podcasts can offer and can be very powerful. It offers a sense of belonging and like-mindedness, but that feeling of community is often parasocial, meaning one-sided. The listener feels a connection to the host or to the voice that they are so familiar with, but that connection is not reciprocal. There, again, is no exchange of ideas. The host does not hear a challenge from an audience member or a question from an audience member that forces that host then to actually think about how what they're saying might be affecting the audience and vice versa, because gaining knowledge is a reciprocal act. Like I am somebody who studied the educator Paulo Freire in my sort of studies in education to out my education nerdiness here. But a foundation of his philosophy of education is that the relationship between teachers and students is dynamic. And to sort of replace that language, the relationship between audience and speaker is dynamic, and those roles are constantly shifting as the exchange of knowledge takes place. And so it's really significant and important to remember that consuming something is not a relationship. That is, it's actually the opposite. It is the taking of something and then the trying to take ownership of it. And that's not true communication. That's not real. And when we're talking about establishing meaningful, healthy relationships, true communication, reciprocal communication is really the foundation of a meaningful, long-lasting relationship. So what happens then is actually, as a consequence, as we might turn to our content, our podcasts, our sort of trusted voices for connection, we might end up actually feeling more isolated at the end because there isn't that exchange and we still don't feel fulfilled. Also, to look at the technological part of this, a lot of the content that we consume, whether that be social media, whether that be sort of searching on different platforms for new podcasts, these are all algorithm-driven services. So the more we search for things along a particular thought pattern, the more the algorithm will reinforce that. So we end up perhaps unintentionally, maybe intentionally, at a subconscious level, creating these echo chambers of repeating ideas and reinforcing of these ideas. And we find ourselves further and further and further from a sense of collectiveness where there is a flow of ideas that might be contrasting, that might be challenging, that might be curious, that might be any of those sorts of words that imply an exchange of ideas. And instead we find ourselves falling down these echo chambers of similarity without challenge. And again, ultimately leading us in a more isolated space. That really creates a danger of only hearing thoughts and opinions that match your own. And that is not how we grow. That is not how we learn. That is not how we connect with people, because is my belief that the deepest, richest connections with people comes from those who challenge us and those who ask us questions and those who work with us to re-examine the things that we hold true so that those truths can evolve and become stronger and better, not those who want to hear the same things that we already believe in order to reinforce their own sense of rightness, because that is not real connection. And as we're talking about the podcast bro personality, this sort of stereotypical meme of a descriptor, I do hesitatingly wade into this conversation of toxic masculinity because I don't think that masculinity is inherently toxic. I think that the idea of masculinity as a concept is very fluid and very individual from person to person. And I think that all people have aspects of masculinity and femininity. But there is a certain subgroup of men, people socialized as men, to adopt this, my favorite thing, air quote, tough guy stereotype. And it's ingrained in many cultures. And it really dictates that men should be stoic, self-reliant, and suppress emotions that are perceived as weak. This sort of killing of weakness is really, really essential to this tough guy persona, this sort of really hyper-masculine idea. And some of this is fueled by societal pressures, which directly conflict with the need for vulnerability, which is required for a meaningful communication. So when faced with the discomfort of expressing emotions, some men may turn to the predictable and controlled environment of a podcast because they can absorb information and opinions without the risk of emotional exposure or the need for reciprocal vulnerability. And really, I think it's that risk that is a huge deterrent for a lot of people when it comes to establishing meaningful relationships, because all relationships, real relationships, require vulnerability, and vulnerability is inherently risky because it is the exposure of things which are tender and which can be hurt easily and which lay at the core of who we are as people. And so it makes sense, because if those things are then touched, if those vulnerable parts are touched by something that somebody says or does, we risk really exposing more. And that again goes against this sort of tough guy, stoic stereotype that is expected of us sometimes. And I find it interesting that there's some research that backs this up. The Journal of Family Psychology published some research that demonstrated a strong correlation between male emotional suppression and relationship difficulties. Other studies have shown that men who struggle to express emotions are more likely to experience conflict, dissatisfaction, and intimacy issues in their relationships. Male stoicism, while often seen as a virtue, can create emotional barriers, preventing deep connection and hindering conflict resolution. And this is potentially not ideal because it creates a situation where minor issues become large issues over time, simply because of avoidance, because there is that fear of vulnerability, there is that feel of appearing weak, and so communication is avoided, and so the small issues become big issues over time, which ultimately leads to the failure of any relationship. So this idea that men should always be strong creates a situation where men don't learn the skills needed to cope with negative emotions, with those feelings that can be challenging to deal with, or to communicate those emotions in a healthy way. And instead, we often find them expressed in very negative, harmful, sometimes violent ways. And whether that violence is physical, emotional, verbal, it's all a way of turning to a more acceptable masculine way of expression. So we look to podcasting then as an escape and as a means of creating an emotional buffer. And emotional buffering refers to the use of an external stimuli, in this case, online content, to avoid or minimize uncomfortable emotions. It's like creating a barrier between yourself and your feelings. So you might constantly listen to podcasts to avoid dealing with anxiety because, again, they are predictable. These are voices and ideas that we're comfortable with and familiar with. And so it's safer to listen to these things that are predictable, which make us feel less anxious, make us feel more in control. You might use online forums to vent frustrations instead of addressing them directly with loved ones, or immersing oneself in gaming streams, like gaming content, to escape feelings of loneliness, these sort of false social interactions. And the potential effects of emotional buffering include stunted emotional development, increased social isolation, and a diminished capacity for genuine intimacy. And intimacy is an episode all in of itself, because we often think of intimacy in terms of physical interactions such as sex and physical contact, but intimacy is an entire range of interactions. The sharing of true feelings, the posing of questions, the demonstrations of vulnerability. These are all ways of showing up in an intimate way with those with whom we have relationships with. And it's that fear of intimacy because of the association with homosexuality, I think, which is another reason why a lot of men have difficulty showing vulnerability, because it is perceived as weak, as feminine. And there is this really gross idea that if we're showing those things, then people are going to perceive us as being, whatever sort of gross epithet you can think of. And again, that's really, really scary. And it's really, really unfortunate that is such a prevalent and ongoing concern that people have. But ultimately, by consistently avoiding emotional discomfort, individuals may lose the ability to navigate complex emotions and build healthy relationships. Because like any other skill or task, or even physical growth in terms of exercise, it takes repetition and practice. And the more we do something, the better at it we get. That includes sharing and communicating and being vulnerable and being curious. And Dr. John Gottman, a renowned relationship expert, states, "The ability to turn towards your partner's bids for emotional connection is the foundation of a healthy relationship. When men consistently turn away, often into distractions like online content, it erodes the emotional bond." And I think in this context, this quote is specifically talking about romantic partners, but I think that when we talk about relationships as partnerships, we can apply this sort of thought, this idea of connection to all types of relationships, because I think that those relationship boundaries that often get put in place between what is a friendship, what is a romantic partnership, etc., are a way of easily limiting the type of connection that we allow ourselves to have with people, when I think in actuality we should be pursuing meaningful, strong connections with any relationship that we have. Again, that's not to say that all relationships are the same and that they should have uniform interactions, but any true relationship, a friendship, a romantic partnership, an intimate partnership, whatever you want to call it, it requires vulnerability, and it requires connection, and it requires the ability to turn towards that person as they bid for connection, and as you bid for connection, you should be able to listen to them as well. Ultimately, using online content as a communication substitute creates a distance. Instead of intimate shared experiences, it creates a situation where one person is present and the other is mentally somewhere else. And when it comes to the people in our actual lives, that will ultimately lead to resentment, right? The partner who needs to connect will feel ignored, and the partner who is using the online content as their buffer will feel a pressure to connect and will move away to the type of relationship with their content that they think seems easier. And in romantic relationships, this might look like a partner trying to share a vulnerable experience only to have their partner respond with a quote from a podcast or whatever expert voice that they're talking about, instead of showing empathy. So someone might say, "I'm really stressed about my job." And their response might say, "Well, yeah, on the podcast, they were talking about stress and they said blah, 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 blah." This response shuts down the other person's attempt to connect. In friendships, it could manifest as a friend who is always distracted by their phone, or who only wants to talk about topics they heard on a podcast without any genuine interest in the other person's life. So this might be like, "Hey, how was your weekend?" And the response, "Oh, I didn't do much, but I listened to this amazing podcast about, cryptocurrency." And the conversation never goes anywhere else. This can play out in family dynamics. It can mean a person who is always listening to podcasts in their free time instead of engaging with their kids. So during dinner, the dad might have one earbud in and is only half listening to the family conversation. And these are very simple examples, but they show how a perhaps unintended, but still a true consequence is that person in these situations experiences feelings of they are not being heard and that their feelings don't matter, which could ultimately lead to interactions where they feel like they're walking on eggshells, or they're afraid to bring up their feelings, or they fear being dismissed or ignored. And it has this sort of cyclical effect of making them feel unsafe, and that their emotional bond is eroding, and that they are starting to feel more and more disconnected, and that resentment can instead take hold. So even as a person who is looking to this content to sort of feel connected with people, might ultimately actually be creating more and more disconnection from the people who they think are important in their lives. What this is really sort of highlighting is, how do we then do the opposite? How do we build connection? And I think maybe what we need is to exercise some pretty basic skills. And these can be as simple as active listening and showing empathy. And active listening goes beyond just hearing words. It involves paying full attention, both verbally and non-verbally. It is eye contact. It is interacting and a showing of engagement. It is not interrupting. It's asking clarifying questions. It is showing a true interest in the events and experiences of the people that you're communicating with. It is being a participant in the conversation. It's putting the phone down. It's taking out the earbuds, and it's being present. And that empathetic part, it means understanding and validating the other person's feelings, even if you don't necessarily agree. It means showing that you can see or at least hear what is being expressed as a true experience for the person to whom you're talking, and saying that that is a true thing, that what you're feeling is valid, what you're experiencing is valid, and I'm here to witness your experience. What this might mean is that as our time becomes more and more filled with things to do, as productivity demands more time, as our children demand more time, as we want to dedicate more and more time to feeling fulfilled and doing things and feeling as if we are able to access all of the stuff that we want to experience, we might actually have to schedule dedicated connection time with people with whom we want to have meaningful connections. It could be as simple as a weekly date night, a daily walk, or even just uninterrupted conversation before bed. It could be engaging in shared activities that promote conversation and connection. It can be even just talking about the difficulties that you're experiencing connecting, because that in and of itself is an act of vulnerability. But it also requires us to reflect on the ways that we are consuming information, the ways that we are consuming content, and the effects that the content that we're consuming is having on us. We need to be able to consider the validity and the I hesitate to use the word truth, but the how the information is resonating with our own experience of what is happening in our lives. Because it is an essential skill to be able to challenge and question the things that we're hearing as fact. It is an essential skill to be able to not just hear things and accept them, but to question them, to doubt them, to see how they resonate with the collection of experiences that you have and weigh them for what they are. But then also to consider, how would this play out if I were talking about this in a real conversation with somebody in real life? How would the people around me hear this information? And if you hesitate to share that content with people in real life, I think that could be a warning. What I'm hoping is that by exploring these ideas, by exploring my own process with content creation and challenging you as an audience to hear what I'm saying and weigh it against your experience, I'm hoping that we can come to a better understanding of what it is that we want in our lives. I think that podcasts and other media that we consume, they have a role in our lives. They can be a healthy role, but they need to be considered as elements in a large collection of ways of connecting and ways of feeling connected and part of a community, rather than isolation, because isolation is obviously the thing that we're trying to avoid. I think that when we feel isolated or alienated at the further extreme, that is when we seek the most extreme perspectives to reinforce that feeling and to make us feel valid in those negative spaces. So what I'm hoping is that you'll look to the people in your life and you will engage, that you'll challenge yourself to let the shields down and connect, that you will put down your screens, you'll put down your phone, your tablet, you'll turn off the TV, and you'll have a conversation, which means not just talking at somebody, and it means not just listening to somebody, but it means sharing, interacting, reciprocating, asking, challenging, hearing feedback, integrating feedback, and coming to a deeper meaning and understanding through shared experience. I hope that this conversation has given you some food for thought, and I'd really love to hear your thoughts. If you have comments or questions, you can email me, finlos@finloslives.com. You can connect with me on social media. I really hope that if you see value in this podcast, that you'll share them with people on your social media networks and leave me some feedback. Go ahead and comment. You can find the podcast on any of your preferred listening platforms, or you can go to finloslives.com. I look forward to our next conversation.